Welcome to West Film, where every movie has a story worth telling. From heart-pounding action to twisty mysteries and dramas that stick with you, we dig into the plot, the characters, and the moments that make each film worth your time. So grab a seat, get comfortable, and let's jump into today's movie. This is West Film. Your story starts here. Years before, he'd survived a horrific attack by natives that left him partially scalped, and that old wound has curdled into hatred, most of it aimed squarely at Hawk. Fitzgerald barely bothers to hide his contempt, but Glass steps between them fast, telling him to back off while urging his son to keep his cool. Out here, the fights happening inside the group can kill you just as easily as anything waiting outside it. Meanwhile, the Arikara haven't given up the chase. Still hunting for Pawaka, they run into a band of French fur traders and cut a grim deal. They help, in exchange for 5 horses. The pursuit rolls on, merciless as ever. Scouting ahead through dense woods, Glass stumbles into a nightmare without realizing it. He's wandered too close to a mother grizzly guarding her cubs. She charges instantly. Glass hits the ground as claws rip into him and jaws crush bone. He manages to fire his rifle, but it doesn't slow her down. Bleeding out and broken, he pulls his knife and fights back with everything he has left. Man and bear go tumbling down the slope together, and when the dust settles, Glass is pinned beneath the animal's dead weight, barely clinging to life. The trappers who find him are horrified. He's mangled, unconscious, and fighting for every breath. Still believing he has a chance, they rig up a makeshift stretcher and try to haul him through the wilderness, though progress is agonizingly slow. At one point, while they're dragging him uphill, Glass slips and takes the others down with him. Some chalk it up to rotten luck. Fitzgerald sees it differently. To him, it's proof that Glass is already as good as dead. He argues that pushing on is a waste of time and puts everyone at risk, and that the merciful thing now is to end Glass's suffering rather than drag it out. Captain Henry won't allow a mercy killing, though. Instead, he offers $75 to anyone willing to stay behind, care for Glass, and bury him once he's gone. Nobody takes the offer until Henry sweetens it to $100. That's what finally gets Fitzgerald to agree. Not compassion, but greed, and lingering resentment over the pelts he lost. Young Jim Bridger steps up too, alongside Hawk, who refuses to leave his father's side. Before the group moves on, Captain Henry makes Fitzgerald swear he'll stay with Glass to the end and see that he's properly buried. They part ways, none of them knowing that promise won't survive the week, or that Hugh Glass's real fight for survival is only just starting. Fitzgerald gives the quiet nod, but out here, a promise doesn't carry much weight. Once Henry and the rest of the party disappear into the trees, Glass drifts in and out of consciousness, pain tearing through him with every breath. His body is wrecked, but his mind won't quit. Memories of his wife keep surfacing, the final moments they shared, the fire that consumed their home. Survival isn't the only thing he's wrestling with. He's also holding on to the last pieces of a life that's already been taken from him. Alone now with Bridger and Hawk, Fitzgerald spots his chance. He crouches beside Glass, who's barely conscious, and murmurs something that sounds like kindness, an offer to end the suffering, framed as a mercy for everyone, Glass included. Glass can't respond. He can barely move. All he can do is stare. Fitzgerald twists the knife further, telling Glass to blink if he agrees, fully aware that no one can keep their eyes open forever. Glass strains against it, forcing his eyes wide with whatever strength he has left, but eventually his eyelids give out. Fitzgerald reads that as consent, or simply chooses to, and presses down, smothering him without a flicker of hesitation. That's the moment Hawk walks back into camp and sees what's happening. He shouts for Bridger, panicked, but never gets the chance to do anything more. Fitzgerald lunges and buries his blade in Hawk's stomach. The young man crumples into the snow, bleeding out. Glass, unable to speak or move, is forced to watch his son die just inches away. trapped inside a body that won't obey him. Fitzgerald hauls Hawk's body off and covers his tracks. When Bridger returns, rattled and confused, Fitzgerald coolly tells him Hawk wandered off and never came back, and with Glass unable to speak or signal otherwise, the lie holds. By the next morning, Fitzgerald pushes the betrayal even further, telling Bridger that Arikara warriors are closing in and that staying put means certain death. It's a complete fabrication, but fear doesn't ask for proof. Bridger wavers, clearly torn, but eventually agrees to leave. As he turns his back, Fitzgerald drags Glass toward a shallow grave, muttering hollow prayers as he shovels dirt over a man who's still very much alive. Glass can't move, can't scream, he can only feel the weight of the earth pressing the breath out of him as everything goes dark. Before they go, Bridger quietly leaves something beside Glass, a metal canteen etched with a spiral. A small gesture, but one loaded with guilt, loyalty, and a sliver of hope. Then they're gone, and Glass is left alone under the frozen ground. Somehow, against every odd, he claws his way back out, tearing through the dirt like he's being born again. But there's no relief waiting for him, just visions of his late wife, and then the gut punch of finding Hawk's frozen body in the snow. His heart shatters, but it also hardens his resolve. Without a word, he makes himself a promise. This isn't how it ends. Running on nothing but raw instinct, Glass relearns how to survive. He wraps himself in a bear pelt for warmth, gnaws on roots and bone marrow to keep his strength up, and pushes through pain that would break most people. When an infected wound in his throat threatens to kill him, he packs it with gunpowder and sets it alight, cauterizing the wound in one brutal, desperate act. With Arikara warriors closing in, still hunting for their chief's missing daughter, Glass throws himself into raging rapids rather than face them, letting the river carry him wherever it wants, driven forward by pain, grief, and a hunger for justice that won't let up. Meanwhile, as Fitzgerald and Bridger make their way toward Fort Kiowa, cracks start showing in Fitzgerald's story. Bridger can't shake the feeling that none of it adds up. The supposed chase, the panic, any of it. He finally confronts Fitzgerald and forces the truth out of him. There were never any warriors on their tail. Bridger grabs his rifle in a rage, but Fitzgerald wrestles it away and pulls the trigger anyway. It clicks, empty. It was never loaded. Just one more lie. Their grim journey continues until they stumble on the burnt-out remains of a settlement, bodies scattered among the ashes. A lone woman emerges from the wreckage, silent and hollow-eyed. Bridger leaves her food without saying a word, a small flicker of decency in a world that's stripped most of it away. When they finally reach Fort Kiowa, Fitzgerald tells one last lie, that Glass died of his wounds and Hawk was almost certainly killed by the Arikara. Bridger, crushed under guilt and fear, says nothing to contradict him. Fitzgerald pockets his blood money while Bridger turns down any extra payment. His silence is already costing him more than he can bear. Back at the fort, Captain Henry delivers bad news of his own. Supplies are running low, the fort's funds are nearly gone, and reinforcements under Colonel Leavenworth are still days out, which means no one gets paid until they arrive. Tension hangs thick in the air. Lies have already been told, trust has already cracked, and betrayal is quietly spreading beneath the surface. Whatever this story is turning into, it's far from finished. Out in the wild, Glass keeps moving alone, weak, starving, half-frozen. Driven purely by instinct, he wades into an icy river and catches a fish bare-handed, eating it raw just to keep himself going. Climbing a nearby hill, he spots a Pawnee man scavenging from a dead bison. His name is Hickok, a man carrying his own losses, not unlike Glass. Glass approaches carefully, wordlessly asking for food, and Hickok tosses him a piece of bison organ, which Glass eats without a second thought. By morning, Hickok notices how badly infected Glass's wounds are, but he also sees something else in him, an unbreakable will burning behind his eyes. Despite his own grief, Hickok offers guidance instead of judgment, telling Glass that vengeance belongs to the Creator, not to men. Bound by shared loss, the two ride together across the harsh landscape. When a violent storm rolls through, Hickock builds a sweat lodge to shelter Glass, who's slipping into fever, and performs a healing ritual inside it, invoking old prayers and spirits. Glass slips into a dream-like state somewhere between agony and hope, and when he finally comes to, the storm has passed and remarkably his wounds have begun to heal. The peace doesn't last. Nearby, French-Canadian trappers capture Hickock and hang him without mercy, another brutal reminder of how little safety exists out here. Glass is alone again, his grief curdling into something even darker. That night, he slips into the trappers' camp and catches their leader, Toussaint, assaulting Pouaka. Glass steps in without hesitation, freeing her and in a startling twist, she turns the tables on Toussaint herself, mutilating him before disappearing into the wilderness. Glass kills several of the hunters, sets their horses loose, Hickock's included, and leaves behind Bridges' engraved canteen as a quiet signal meant for anyone who understands its meaning. But his ordeal isn't over. The next day, Arikara warriors force him off a cliff while he's on horseback. A tree breaks his fall and saves his life, but the horse doesn't survive. As night falls and the cold turns lethal, Glass makes a grim call. He guts the horse and crawls inside its carcass for warmth. At dawn, he pulls himself free and finds shelter in a snow cave, where he carves a message into the ice. Fitzgerald killed my son. What started as a fight to survive has become a mission built on vengeance. Back at Fort Kiowa, things boil over when a lone French trapper shows up carrying Bridges' canteen, now the same one thought lost with Hawk. Captain Henry immediately sends out a search party and rides off himself to find Glass. Fitzgerald, realizing Glass must be alive, steals the fort's payroll and bolts into the wilderness. The search party eventually finds Glass near the Yellowstone River, beaten up but alive, and brings him back. Henry, furious over the betrayal, first turns his anger on Bridger, but Glass steps in, making clear that Fitzgerald's lies are behind everything that's gone wrong. Fueled by vengeance, Glass insists on joining the manhunt. As the two of them split up to track Fitzgerald down, tragedy hits again. Glass finds Henry's body, scalped and lifeless, more proof of just how far Fitzgerald will go. Swallowing his pain, Glass plays dead and waits, then strikes when the moment's right, ambushing Fitzgerald and putting a bullet in his shoulder. The chase ends on a riverbank, where the two collide in a brutal, desperate struggle. Blood, rage, and pure survival instinct all tangled together. Glass gets the upper hand and is ready to finish it, but Hickock's words come back to him: vengeance belongs to the creator. Instead of delivering the final blow, he shoves Fitzgerald into the rushing current, which carries him straight to Elk Dog and Pouaka. The Arikara deal out their own justice, killing Fitzgerald and letting Glass live. Spent and broken, Glass collapses by the river, and in that quiet space between life and death, he sees his wife once more. She smiles at him gently, then fades into the trees, a silent goodbye, a sign that his brutal journey has finally reached its end. Some films entertain you, some impress you, and then there are films that test you. The Revenant isn't something you just watch, it's something you get through. From its opening frame, it drags you into a frozen world where nothing about survival is guaranteed, pain never lets up, and nature couldn't care less who you are. There are no rousing speeches, no swelling score reassuring you it'll all work out. Just wind, blood, breath, and the terrifying quiet of the wilderness. What sets The Revenant apart isn't only its unflinching realism, it's how the film strips cinema down to something almost primal. Every wound feels genuine. Every trudge through the snow feels exhausting. Every moment reminds you just how fragile a human life really is. This isn't simply a survival story, it's a story about refusing to die even when your own body is begging you to give up. In this piece, we'll dig into The Revenant, its haunting themes, its buried symbolism, its unforgettable ending, and why it still ranks among the most intense films ever made. So brace yourself, because this trip through ice, pain, and obsession isn't an easy one, but it's one that sticks with you. Released in 2015, The Revenant comes from director Alejandro González inverted exclamation mark les I tilde plus minus a tilde inverted exclamation mark Ritu, a filmmaker known for pushing both his cast and his audience well outside their comfort zones. Leonardo DiCaprio stars in what's easily one of the most physically punishing roles of his career, a performance so grueling it would go on to define his legacy. But this isn't your typical star vehicle. Here, the landscape gets just as much attention as the actors do. Set in the early 1800s, deep in the American frontier, the story unfolds during a time when the land was wild, lawless, and utterly unforgiving, and civilization was little more than a rumor. Survival hinges on instinct, endurance, and no small amount of luck. At its heart, The Revenant follows a hardened frontiersman on a fur-trapping expedition through hostile territory. When a devastating attack leaves him gravely wounded and stranded, the film pivots into a relentless survival journey powered by sheer willpower and a desperate hold on life itself. The key thing to understand is that this movie isn't built around plot twists or sharp dialogue. It's about presence. It drops you directly into the cold, the hunger, and the isolation, and asks you to live through survival moment by moment. No spoilers here, just this. The Revenant cares less about where the story ends up and more about what it costs to keep going. And that's exactly what makes it so unforgettable. On the surface, The Revenant looks like a straightforward survival tale, a man against nature, life against impossible odds. But that's only the top layer. The film actually sits at the crossroads of three genres: a survival, historical drama, and revenge. And instead of leaning into spectacle, it strips each one down to its rawest, most uncomfortable core. Survival here isn't heroic, it's ugly, painful, and humiliating. Staying alive doesn't make the protagonist noble, it just makes him desperate. Every choice comes from instinct, not courage. Revenge isn't framed as justice, either. It's framed as a burden, a fire that keeps the body moving while slowly eating away at everything else. Morality, peace, identity. And then there's nature, which isn't a backdrop here so much as the dominant force in the story, a silent, indifferent, and relentless. The cold doesn't hate you, the river doesn't care about your past. Survival is never earned outright, it's only ever temporarily granted. Emotionally, the film sits in a bleak, meditative register. Dialogue is sparse because it's often unnecessary. A pain, breath, and movement do the talking instead. The tone asks the audience to slow down and sit with suffering rather than look away from it. This isn't a film built for casual viewing, it's for people willing to lean into discomfort. Because The Revenant isn't really asking whether revenge is justified, it's asking whether it's worth surviving for. That question hums beneath every frozen frame. The story kicks off in chaos. A fur-trapping expedition pushes into hostile wilderness, a land that was never theirs and never pretends to be safe. Danger surrounds the group from every direction: the environment, hostile tribes, and the simple fact that a single mistake out here can be fatal. At the center of it all is Hugh Glass, a seasoned frontiersman who knows the land better than most, though experience offers no real protection once nature decides to strike. A sudden, savage attack leaves Glass catastrophically injured, barely clinging to life. The expedition faces an impossible choice: haul a dying man through hostile territory and risk everyone, or leave him behind. Two men agree to stay with him until the end, and what follows isn't just abandonment, it's outright betrayal. Glass is left alone in a frozen wilderness with no weapons, no shelter, and no real chance of survival. And yet, he refuses to die. What comes next is a punishing journey across snow, rivers, and mountains. Glass crawls when he can't walk, eats when there's food, and suffers when there isn't. Every step forward costs him something. This isn't a triumphant survival montage, it's a chain of cause and effect. Injury breeds isolation, isolation breeds desperation, and desperation fuels movement, beneath all of it is a single driving force, not heroism, not glory, but survival tangled up with unresolved rage. The story moves slowly and deliberately, forcing the audience to feel time the way Glass does, measured not in days but in breaths and endured pain. This isn't a journey toward triumph, it's a journey towards staying alive long enough to face the truth of what was taken from him. And every frozen mile brings that reckoning closer, at a steep price. After everything, the cold, the wounds, the hunger, the betrayal, the final confrontation arrives. The moment the entire film has been building toward. Revenge is finally within reach, and something like justice is right there for the taking. But instead of a clean, satisfying payoff, the film deliberately pulls back. Rather than seizing control of the outcome, Glass lets go. He releases his obsession and hands the final call over to nature and fate. It's a turning point. Survival, not revenge, becomes the last real act of strength. Symbolically, it says everything the film has been building toward. Revenge kept Glass alive, but it could never have given him peace. The wilderness, which has punished him from the start, now becomes his judge. The same indifferent force that nearly killed him now brings the story to a close without fanfare or celebration. Then comes the final shot. Hugh Glass staring straight into the camera. It's not a victorious look. It's not relief, either. It's exhaustion, and something close to emptiness. That gaze closes the gap between character and audience, silently asking, was it worth it? The ending stays intentionally open-ended, not because the story lacks closure, but because survival itself is the closure. There's no reward waiting on the other side, just breath. Just life. The Revenant ends the only honest way it can, not with revenge fulfilled, but with a man who's survived everything and now has to live with it. One of the most striking things about The Revenant is how much it communicates without ever saying a word. The film hides its meaning inside its visuals, its movement, and its silences, rewarding anyone paying close attention. Take nature, for starters. It's not just a setting, it's a silent judge. Wide shots constantly dwarf the characters, a reminder that no matter how strong or determined a person feels, the wilderness stays indifferent. The snow doesn't pause for grief, the river doesn't care about revenge. That visual scale quietly reinforces the film's core idea: people don't conquer nature, they just temporarily get away with surviving it. Then there's the recurring imagery of breath. We see Glass constantly gasping into the cold air, each exhale visible, fragile, and fleeting, a reminder of how thin life really is, how quickly it can vanish. Breath equals existence, and the film never lets you forget how close he is to losing his. Fire works as another key symbol. Wherever it shows up, it represents survival, memory, and a flicker of human presence in an otherwise hostile world. Fire keeps Glass alive, but it also drags up memories of everything he's lost. Warmth and pain sit side by side. There's a strong spiritual undercurrent throughout, too. Glass's visions blur the line between life and death, suggesting rebirth rather than mere recovery, as if he's not just surviving but being remade. He reads less like a man heading back to civilization and more like a soul passing through suffering. And then there's foreshadowing. Danger tends to arrive quietly: a calm river before the chaos, a still forest before the violence. The film trains you to fear stillness, because in this world, peace never lasts. None of this gets spelled out for the audience, it's meant to be felt. That's what makes The Revenant so powerful. It doesn't hold your hand. It asks you to watch, endure, and interpret, the same way its protagonist has to. The closer you look, the more the wilderness seems to speak back. What makes The Revenant even more remarkable is knowing how brutal it was to actually make. This wasn't a studio-bound production, it was survived. Director I_A_, who made the bold, controversial call to shoot almost entirely with natural light, which meant the crew had only a handful of usable hours each day, racing against the sun, the cold, and the weather. Temperatures regularly dropped well below freezing. Equipment failed. Crew members quit. Entire locations had to be abandoned once the snow melted too fast, forcing the production to relocate to different countries just to keep the environment authentic. Then there's Leonardo DiCaprio, whose commitment to the role bordered on extreme. He endured freezing rivers, brutal terrain, and constant exposure to the elements, often performing while genuinely exhausted, injured, and miserable, closer to living the character's suffering than acting it. The payoff was a performance so raw and uncompromising that it finally landed DiCaprio his first Best Actor Oscar, one that felt less like recognition and more like a reward for endurance. Even the film's realism came at a cost. Long takes, handheld cameras, and minimal dialogue meant mistakes couldn't be hidden, so if anything went wrong, the whole sequence had to be reshot, often in even harsher conditions. There were no shortcuts here and no green screens to soften the ordeal, no safety nets to smooth over the pain. That's precisely why the film feels as real as it does. Behind every frozen frame sits a crew and cast who genuinely endured the wilderness so the story could feel earned. When people talk about The Revenant, comparisons to other survival films come up constantly, but they only go so far. Sure, it shares some DNA with movies like Castaway or Into the Wild, all of which explore isolation, endurance, and the will to survive. But where those films lean toward introspection and hope, The Revenant chooses suffering and resistance instead. There's no comfort in solitude here, no peace found in nature, only persistence. It also gets lumped in with classic revenge films, but that's exactly where it breaks the mold. Traditional revenge stories build toward a cathartic moment where justice feels earned and satisfying. The Revenant refuses that payoff entirely. Revenge here isn't empowering, it's corrosive. It keeps the body moving while quietly draining the soul. Rather than glorify vengeance, the film questions whether it's even worth surviving for. Stylistically, it often gets placed alongside historical epics like Braveheart or The Last of the Mohicans, but unlike those films, the heroism here has none of the usual romance attached to it. No speeches, no rallying cries, no cinematic victory laps, just breath, blood, and motion. Where The Revenant really excels compared to its peers is immersion. The camera doesn't watch from a comfortable distance, it suffers right alongside the character. Long takes, natural lighting, and sparse dialogue pull the audience directly into the experience instead of letting them observe from safety. That approach comes with a trade-off, though. Compared to more conventional narratives, the pacing can feel sluggish. The film demands patience. It doesn't set out to entertain, it sets out to confront. And that's the real difference. The Revenant was never trying to be the most exciting survival movie ever made, it was trying to be the most honest one. Whether you admire it or wrestle with it, there's really nothing else quite like it. When The Revenant hit theaters, it didn't just spark conversation, it split audiences right down the middle. Critics largely hailed it as a cinematic achievement, praising its breathtaking cinematography, its realism, and DiCaprio's performance, which was almost universally recognized as one of the most physically demanding turns ever put on screen. Awards followed fast. Oscar buzz turned into actual Oscar wins, cementing the film's status as a major prestige event. Audience reactions, though, told a messier story. Some viewers were completely swept up, calling the film intense, immersive, and unforgettable. For them, the slow pacing and sparse dialogue weren't weaknesses, they were essential to the whole experience. Others felt pushed away, finding it exhausting, too cold, too slow, too punishing. Some went in expecting a straightforward revenge thriller and were caught off guard by something far more meditative and restrained. That's exactly where The Revenant carves out its own space. It was never built to please everyone. Over time, it's settled into a distinct spot in film history, not a crowd pleaser, but a challenge. a movie that rewards patience and punishes distraction. Is it overrated? Only if you show up expecting pure entertainment. Is it underrated? Not by critics, say maybe just by viewers who haven't revisited it with the right expectations in place. The Revenant is divisive on purpose. And that division is part of what it's remembered for. Sometimes the intensity of a reaction is the real measure of a film's power. So after all that suffering, silence, and all those frozen miles, what's The Revenant actually worth? At its best, it's a technical and emotional achievement. The cinematography is breathtaking, the performances are raw and deeply physical, and the atmosphere is so immersive it feels less like a movie and more like something you survive. It's not flawless, though. The pacing is deliberately slow, and that patience won't work for everyone. Dialogue is minimal, emotion is restrained, and the film asks for your full attention. If you're after comfort, escapism, or easy entertainment, look elsewhere. But if you're drawn to serious cinema, if you value storytelling told through images rather than words, and you're willing to sit with discomfort in exchange for authenticity, then The Revenant is absolutely worth your time. It's a film for people who value immersion over spectacle, who don't need a clean-cut victory to feel satisfied, and who understand that survival itself can be the whole story. The Revenant isn't asking to be loved, it's asking to be respected, and in the end, that's exactly what it earns. If you haven't seen it, watch it once with no distractions. If you have, watch it again knowing exactly what it is, because some films fade the moment the credits roll, and others, like this one, stay with you long after the cold has settled in. Reviews: The Revenant stands as one of the best films of 2015, and it fully earns the praise it received. Audience reactions have been mixed, but I think the harsh criticism and low scores it's gotten are unfair. Even setting emotional impact aside, the sheer technical craft on display would justify a strong score on its own. The cinematography, direction, and performances are simply too accomplished to dismiss. Visually, it's extraordinary, arguably one of the most stunningly shot films of its year, capturing raw wilderness with the realism that feels almost overwhelming. The natural lighting, the atmospheric locations, and the immersive camera work pull you straight into the character's harsh world. Ritu's direction here even surpasses his work on Birdman, delivering some of the year's strongest filmmaking. The performances match that ambition. DiCaprio delivers a physically and emotionally exhausting turn that finally earned him his long-overdue Oscar, deservedly so. With almost no dialogue, he leans entirely on expression, movement, and presence to convey suffering, determination, and grief, and it lands powerfully. Tom Hardy brings tense, menacing energy, and Will Poulter also makes a strong impression. Every actor fully commits to the brutality of the story's environment and tone. Beyond the acting and visuals, the action sequences hit hard, especially the opening ambush, which throws the audience straight into chaos. The camera placement and framing make these scenes feel disorienting and frightening, capturing the abrupt violence of frontier survival. Weapons that feel throwaway in other films come across as genuinely dangerous here, adding to the tension. The narrative itself stays deliberately simple and slow, but that restraint lets the emotional weight settle. The characters feel grounded and believable, shaped by desperation and isolation. If there's a weak spot, it's the script, which occasionally feels uneven or unfocused, but that's a minor flaw that barely dents the overall impact. The story draws from the real-life figure of Hugh Glass, and while the film clearly exaggerates events for dramatic effect, it still captures the spirit of endurance and revenge tied to the legend. Some of the historical liberties are obvious, and at points the film pushes plausibility further than it probably should. If the character had been purely fictional, those excesses would likely be easy to swallow, but balancing historical inspiration with dramatic license is always tricky. What bothers me most is the dismissive one-star reviews the film's picked up from some corners. Disliking a movie is fair game, but docking it purely because of its popularity or awards buzz feels lazy. The Revenant deserves to be judged on its craftsmanship, not punished for its success. Set in the early 19th century American frontier, the film explores a period rarely portrayed with this level of intensity. A survival here feels raw and evenly matched, long before modern conveniences tip the scales. The brutal winter landscape dominates the screen so thoroughly that the environment itself becomes a character, cold, unforgiving, relentless. DiCaprio carries nearly the entire film on his back, appearing in almost every scene and conveying emotion through physical endurance rather than dialogue, a performance that echoes other deeply committed portrayals where the actor and the character's suffering become inseparable. The Oscar win wasn't just justified, it felt inevitable. In the end, The Revenant is a brutal, mesmerizing watch. It isn't easy, but it is powerful, visually stunning, emotionally draining, and technically masterful, standing as one of the most striking survival dramas ever committed to film. Shortly after Hugh Glass is gravely wounded, the man assigned to stay behind and look after him ends up abandoning that duty entirely, betraying Glass and killing someone deeply important to him. That single act of cruelty sets the stage for a punishing revenge story. Director Ritter has quickly become one of the most visually distinctive filmmakers working today, and this film keeps that momentum going. Much like Birdman before it, this project pushes his visual ambitions even further, resulting in something that feels fresh and immersive despite telling a story cinema has revisited many times before. At its core, this is a familiar tale of survival and vengeance, but modern audiences are unlikely to feel worn out by it, since this particular flavor of frontier western has been largely missing from theaters lately. Some might hesitate to call it a traditional western outright, but the brutal native attack, the infamous bear encounter, and the unforgiving final showdown firmly plant it in that genre, just in a raw, unconventional form. The film's biggest strength is its stunning imagery. The natural landscapes are captured with such realism that the experience feels physically demanding even from the audience's seat. The performances from DiCaprio and Hardy are equally impressive, with Hardy in particular delivering a chilling, morally bankrupt character whose cruelty feels unsettlingly authentic. He relies less on dialogue and more on sheer presence, which makes his sparse-spoken lines land with real weight. DiCaprio, meanwhile, offers a restrained but fully committed performance, conveying pain and determination mostly through expression instead of speech. It might not rank among his absolute best work, but it's still a powerful showcase of his willingness to push through physically brutal roles. The environment itself practically functions as a character. The frozen wilderness feels hostile and unrelenting, and who makes sure the audience feels every bit of Glass's suffering. The now famous bear attack is staged with startling intensity, and the film's willingness to embrace uncompromising violence adds to its realism rather than feeling gratuitous. Visually, it stands as one of 2015's most striking films, carried by two commanding lead performances. Inspired by real events, the film delivers a rugged, visceral account of endurance and revenge. Glass, a fur trapper, survives both a native attack and a savage mauling by a grizzly bear, left for dead by his companions, including the cold-blooded John Fitzgerald. He endures unimaginable hardship in his pursuit of justice. Shot primarily with natural light, the cinematography is exceptional, and the digital effects used in the bear sequence blend in seamlessly. That said, the film isn't without its flaws. Despite its technical polish, it can feel overly long and emotionally distant at times. The near-total lack of meaningful female roles stands out, and the few that do appear show up in an especially disturbing context. The performances are intense, but the film can feel oddly hollow underneath all that surface brutality. Certain plot choices, particularly around the final pursuit of Fitzgerald, feel implausible and underdeveloped, as if engineered purely to force a climax rather than growing organically out of the story. Coming off major awards success the year before, I tilde plus minus a tilde inverted exclamation mark Ritter quickly followed up with another prestige project that drew widespread attention. It went on to earn major honors, including big wins at the Golden Globes, and finally seemed to position DiCaprio for the Oscar recognition he'd long been chasing. Running well over 2.5 hours, the film splits its focus between Glass's desperate fight for survival and the actions of the men who abandoned him. Tom Hardy's villain proves especially compelling, not a simple bad guy, but a deeply flawed outsider driven by greed, ruthlessness, and resentment of Glass's resilience and leadership. One standout moment comes when another character threatens him with a rifle, only for the gun to jam a beat that reveals just how cynically Fitzgerald understands human weakness, adding real depth to what could have been a flat antagonist. In the end, the film stands as a brutal, visually striking exploration of survival, revenge, and endurance. Its ambition and craftsmanship are undeniable, but its emotional payoff may leave some viewers cold, making it a powerful yet imperfect piece of cinema. This isn't a story with a single clear-cut villain to point to. Looking at DiCaprio's work here, what stands out most is just how physical the performance is, almost entirely non-verbal, leaning far more on body language and sheer endurance than dialogue. He barely speaks throughout, occasionally using fragments of a native language, which only deepens the sense of isolation running through the film. The infamous bear attack is easily one of the most unforgettable sequences of 2015, a harrowing, brutal, and hard to watch, yet impossible to look away from. That said, some of the material involving his native companion and the broader indigenous storylines didn't land as hard for me as they could have. They felt like they were missing emotional depth and a stronger impact. Even so, the filmmakers pull off something impressive. A film this long that rarely drags. Despite the runtime, it keeps its momentum for nearly the entire ride. This is very much a theater experience. The vast frozen wilderness dominates every frame, creating an overwhelming, harsh atmosphere that shapes the entire mood. The snow-covered landscapes are bleak, unforgiving, and beautiful all at once. And it wouldn't be surprising to see the cinematography honored again. Now the visual craft here is exceptional. It's not among my personal favorites of that year, but it's still a gripping experience, and DiCaprio's commitment alone makes it worth watching. It was also nice to see Domhnall Gleeson take on a more sympathetic role, proving his range once again. The final shot, DiCaprio staring straight into the camera, lingers long after the film ends, quiet, unsettling, and deeply haunting. I'd known all about this 2015 release for years but didn't actually sit down to watch it until 2023. I've never been particularly drawn to DiCaprio's work, so I never felt a strong pull to seek it out earlier. After more than 2.5 hours with the film, I can't say it felt like I'd missed some defining cinematic milestone. It was engaging enough and competently made, but not something I found extraordinary or memorable enough to revisit. The screenplay, credited to Mark L. Smith, tilde plus minus a tilde inverted exclamation mark Ritu, and drawn from Michael Punk's novel, is solid and functional. It delivers a story that does its job without going much further than that. The film works well enough while it's playing, but I doubt I'll be compelled to watch it again. Visually, though, it excels. The staging, the choreography, and the overall design put you convincingly inside a harsh frontier world, with the cinematography doing much of the heavy lifting to bring the environment and ordeal vividly to life. The bear encounter in particular stands out for its raw, unfiltered intensity. The supporting cast does fine work, though character development stays fairly thin across the long runtime, leaving parts of the experience feeling somewhat shallow. The performances overall are strong. DiCaprio handles the demanding lead role well, but for me, Tom Hardy is the real standout, delivering a layered, engaging turn that ends up giving the film much of its emotional weight. It's a shame actors like Brendan Fletcher and Christopher Ash weren't given more to work with. This film arrived squarely in awards season, when studios tend to push out serious, physically grueling productions clearly built for recognition. Whether it counts as truly great or just important is up for debate, but there's no disputing that the cast and crew went through real hardship making it. The freezing locations and punishing conditions read as authentic on screen, and that realism pays off. The constant sense of survival, the brutality, and the contrast between fragile human bodies and an overwhelming natural world are the film's strongest core. Technically, it's impressive from start to finish. From the early bear sequence to the sweeping shots of icy landscapes, it balances tight, chaotic moments with grand scale remarkably well. Much of the story unfolds with minimal dialogue as the protagonist claws his way back from the edge of death in pursuit of revenge. That journey is grueling and deliberately exhausting, which can also make it demanding to sit through. The pacing is slow, deliberate, and unrelenting, effective, but far from comforting. It's not a film you throw on to unwind. Even so, the time never felt wasted to me. The relentless brutality and focused vision kept me engaged, even if I never felt deeply invested in the finer details of the characters themselves. Ultimately, the film works less as a character study and more as an immersive survival experience, tied together by recurring themes of loss, endurance, and the bond between parent and child. Revenge might be what drives the plot forward, but it's only one layer of what the film's actually exploring. A survival, loss, and instinct run deeper beneath it, reflected not just in the protagonist's actions but in the Native American characters who shape the story as well. Even the infamous bear attack can be read as an act of parental protection rather than random violence. It's an intriguing angle, though it doesn't always land as powerfully as intended. At times the revenge plot feels more like a mechanical device pushing things forward, and the dreamlike connection to Glass's deceased wife doesn't do much to deepen the emotional stakes. A secondary storyline about a father searching for his kidnapped daughter adds only modest weight of its own. Ironically, the most affecting relationship in the whole film might be the one between the orphaned bear cubs left behind after their mother's death, a moment that resonates more than a lot of the human connections on screen. The cast fully embodies the harshness of the setting, wearing the physical and emotional toll naturally. DiCaprio rightfully draws the spotlight, but the supporting performances hold their own. Arguably Tom Hardy steals the show, delivering the most memorable dialogue and the most clearly defined character, with many of the film's standout moments built around him. Still, the true star here is the technical craft. Visually striking and meticulously put together, the film excels in atmosphere, sound design, and environmental realism, elevating the experience even when the character work occasionally comes up short. It succeeds most as a raw portrait of humanity's struggle against nature rather than as an intimate character study. Set in the early 1800s, the story follows Captain Andrew Henry, explorer Hugh Glass, and a fur-trapping expedition ambushed by Native Americans. Only a handful survive, escaping downriver with their pelts. Gravely injured after a brutal bear mauling and presumed dead, Glass is abandoned by his own companions, left behind without burial and clinging to life on the strength of a single purpose: revenge, specifically against John Fitzgerald, the man responsible for leaving him behind. They thought he was finished. They hoped he was gone. They were wrong. What follows is a grueling test of endurance as Glass crawls through the frozen wilderness, powered by pure will. Blood is lost, life is clawed back, and the line between death and rebirth blurs. Revenge and survival form the entire backbone of the story. Loosely based on Michael Punk's novel, the film dramatizes the ordeal of the real trapper Hugh Glass, although the historical record on his personal life is thin, and there's no confirmed account of a wife or children, meaning the film takes real creative liberties there. Glass's story has been adapted before, most notably in 1971's Man in the Wilderness, starring Richard Harris. Interest in that earlier film picked back up after The Revenant's success, leading to a Blu-ray release in 2016. The broader theme of one man battling the wilderness alone has also shown up in films like Jeremiah Johnson and A Man Called Horse, proof of its lasting appeal. The Revenant is packed with powerful, unflinching scenes of violence, yet somehow maintains a relatively restrained rating given its intensity. DiCaprio delivers a physically punishing, emotionally raw performance as Glass, doing his own stunts under brutal conditions and earning widespread acclaim and multiple awards for it. Tom Hardy's ruthless Fitzgerald is just as effective, earning him his own critical recognition, and the strong supporting cast rounds things out, adding credibility and depth throughout. Ultimately, The Revenant is a visually stunning, technically masterful film. Its characters may not always hit the emotional depth the story promises, but its portrayal of survival, vengeance, and humanity's fragile place within nature still makes for a compelling, unforgettable experience. The film is further elevated by its haunting score from Ryuichi Sakamoto and Alvin, paired with the award-winning cinematography from Mexican cinematographer Emmanuel Lubezki. Ritu, who co-wrote the script with Mark L. Smith, delivers a visually striking, emotionally relentless piece of work. Known for films like Amos Perros, Babel, 21 Grams, Beautiful, and Birdman, he once again proves he can craft stories that are both brutal and mesmerizing. There are very few moments in this film that let the audience breathe, as the intensity almost never lets up. The story opens with a vicious attack by Native American warriors, and before the shock of that fully settles, the film launches straight into the widely publicized, harrowing bear attack on DiCaprio's character. I've never been particularly fond of DiCaprio's work, but it's impossible to ignore the sheer physical and emotional commitment he brings here. His Best Actor win feels completely earned. Going in, I assumed the film would sweep the top awards. Having seen it, I understand why it might not have been an easy pick for every Academy voter. This isn't a comfortable watch. Several scenes, especially the aftermath of the bear mauling, are deeply unsettling and hard to sit through. The injuries Glass sustains are so severe they call to mind the graphic suffering in The Passion of the Christ, making you wonder how anyone could endure that kind of trauma while also facing freezing temperatures and a merciless wilderness. Throughout, the audience is constantly reminded of just how hostile the environment is as Glass fights through brutal terrain, driven by a single purpose: survival and revenge. At its core, the film makes a powerful statement about human endurance and Glass's refusal to give up, no matter the odds. The word revenant itself refers to someone who returns either from the brink of death or, in the more supernatural sense, as a ghost, and that definition captures the spirit of the story perfectly. My excitement for this film started months before release and only grew as it racked up nominations and awards, backed by the reputation of an Oscar, BAFTA, and Golden Globe-winning director. Inspired by real events and set in 1823, the story unfolds in the untamed wilderness of the Louisiana Purchase. A quasi-military group of trappers led by Captain Andrew Henry, Domhnall Gleeson, is on a fur hunting expedition when Arikara warriors ambush them. Only about half the group escapes by raft, salvaging what supplies they can while under constant threat of pursuit. During the retreat, seasoned frontiersman Hugh Glass, DiCaprio, gets separated from the group and unknowingly wanders into a mother grizzly's territory. The resulting attack leaves him brutally injured and barely alive. He manages to kill the bear, but his wounds are catastrophic. The group does what little it can to treat him, hauling him on a crude stretcher that slows their progress to a crawl. Tensions rise when John Fitzgerald, Tom Hardy, suggests putting Glass out of his misery. Captain Henry can't bring himself to do it and instead offers payment to anyone willing to stay behind with the dying man. Glass's son, Hawk, Forrest Goodluck, and young Jim Bridger, Will Poulter, volunteer, and Fitzgerald eventually joins them once Henry raises the reward, promising to see Glass properly buried once he's gone. Once the rest of the group moves on, though, Fitzgerald tries to suffocate Glass. Hawk catches him in the act and is murdered by Fitzgerald while Glass, unable to speak or move, is forced to watch. When Bridger returns, Fitzgerald claims Hawk was taken by Native Americans, and though Bridger has his doubts, he ultimately agrees to abandon Glass, leaving him in a shallow grave with nothing but a canteen marked by a carved spiral. Against every expectation, Glass survives. Weak, wounded, and alone, he drags himself through the wilderness, surviving on roots and pure instinct. The same Arikara tribe keeps roaming the area, their chief desperately searching for his kidnapped daughter, and Glass narrowly escapes death several times, including a perilous plunge down a freezing river. Meanwhile, Captain Henry and the remaining trappers reach a crumbling outpost. Fitzgerald and Bridger arrive later. Bridger knows the truth but is too intimidated to speak up. Fitzgerald falsely reports Glass's death and Hawk's disappearance and collects his pay, while Bridger, weighed down by guilt, refuses his share. Along the way, Glass crosses paths with Hickok, Arthur Red Cloud, a kind-hearted Pawnee man who, like Glass, is driven by loss and a need for justice. During a fierce snowstorm, Hickok builds him a shelter, but by morning, Glass discovers his companion has been brutally killed and left hanging by nearby French fur trappers. Continuing on, Glass intervenes to save a Native American girl from an assault, later learning she's the kidnapped daughter of the Arikara chief, and escapes on a horse stolen from the French. In the chaos, he unknowingly leaves his spiral-carved canteen behind. Soon after, hostile Arikara warriors force him off a cliff on horseback. He survives the fall but loses the horse, and after gutting it for shelter against the freezing night, suffers even more injuries. Back at the outpost, the discovery of the spiral-marked canteen convinces Captain Henry that Glass may still be alive. Fitzgerald reaches the same conclusion, steals the contents of the fort's safe, and flees. Henry's men eventually track down Glass and bring him back. Furious at Fitzgerald's betrayal, Henry launches a search that comes up empty. Glass clears Bridger's name, proving he was deceived, and Henry resolves to hunt Fitzgerald down himself. Glass, despite his weakened state, insists on joining him. The two split up to corner Fitzgerald, but Henry is ambushed and killed. Glass later finds his body and sets a trap of his own. Wounded again, he chases Fitzgerald to the river, where the two clash in a final, savage fight. At the last second, Glass holds back from killing him, remembering Hickok's words about letting revenge be claimed by fate, and instead sends the badly wounded Fitzgerald downstream, where the Arikara capture him. Reunited with his daughter, the chief executes Fitzgerald and spares Glass. Even with his vengeance complete, Glass remains haunted by visions of the wife and son he lost. The film features strong supporting work from Paul Anderson, Christopher Rouse, Joshua Berg, Lucas Hayes, Brendan Fletcher, and Wayne Howard. DiCaprio delivers a powerful, Oscar-winning performance as the battered frontiersman, fully embodying a man pushed to his limits by nature and betrayal, while Tom Hardy is equally compelling as the ruthless, genuinely menacing Fitzgerald. The supporting cast adds real depth and grounding throughout. Set against the unforgiving wilderness of 1820s America, this true story-inspired tale of survival, revenge, and redemption is visually breathtaking, relying heavily on natural light to capture the raw beauty and brutality of the environment. Watching one man battle freezing rivers, starvation, and relentless enemies is intense and unforgettable, and the film went on to earn widespread acclaim, sweeping major awards for cinematography and sound while also picking up recognition for visual effects, production design, and overall craft. It stands as a gripping historical revenge epic and a testament to human endurance against overwhelming odds. The story takes plenty of liberties with historical accuracy, as many based on true events films do, but that hardly dents its impact. From the thrilling opening ambush to the shockingly realistic bear attack, the tension never really lets up. Once Glass is alone in the wilderness, the film conveys isolation and despair masterfully. You can almost feel the cold and exhaustion as he crawls through snow and icy rivers, driven purely by desperation. It's a brutal, immersive, unforgettable piece of filmmaking. The performances across the board are strong, and it's hardly surprising DiCaprio finally landed his long-awaited Oscar for this role. His portrayal of Hugh Glass is intensely physical, and he clearly pushed through extreme conditions to bring the character to life. Tom Hardy is equally compelling as the ruthless Fitzgerald, delivering a chilling, memorable antagonist. Even with a runtime pushing close to 2.5 hours, the pacing stays engaging, and the film never feels like a slog. Some scenes are undeniably brutal and might unsettle more sensitive viewers, but overall it's easy to recommend. Set in the early 1820s, the story follows a frontiersman on a fur trading expedition who's savagely attacked by a bear and abandoned by his own crew, forced into a relentless fight for survival. Hugh Glass's legend has been reshaped many times over the past 2 centuries. There's the supposed true account, which can never be fully verified, plus biographies, fictionalized retellings, and an earlier adaptation from the early 1970s that remains oddly hard to find today. This version takes creative liberties, most notably by giving Glass a son, a change that raises the emotional stakes. Is it historically accurate? Probably not, but strict fidelity to fact has rarely been a requirement for powerful storytelling. Arriving in the thick of awards season, the film quickly became a dominant contender, racking up double-digit nominations and looking like an airlock for multiple wins. Much of the attention centered on DiCaprio, whose decades-long career spans a huge range of memorable roles. Some have been flashier than others, but his commitment has rarely wavered. And as Glass, he delivers arguably the most demanding, impressive performance of his career, barely speaking for long stretches and relying instead on physical expression and raw presence, which takes real skill and restraint to pull off. Award races, though, aren't decided purely on difficulty or effort. They're meant to reward the best performance of a given year, not just a career milestone. Even by that standard, DiCaprio's chances were strong, despite formidable competition from actors like Eddie Redmayne, Bryan Cranston, and Michael Fassbender, none of whom pushed themselves quite as far physically and emotionally. In the supporting category, Tom Hardy earned well-deserved recognition for a performance that's vicious, morally bankrupt, and strangely captivating, in some moments even more entertaining than the leads. That said, the competition there was tougher, thanks to an unexpected challenger whose nomination carried real career-spanning weight. And award voters often factor legacy and longevity into the mix in unpredictable ways. Hardy absolutely deserved the win, but it was never a sure thing. Beyond acting, the film also picked up nominations for makeup, costume, and production design, where it had a strong shot at success. One of its most outstanding technical achievements, though, is the cinematography, a breathtaking, immersive, almost tactile in how it captures the harsh beauty of the wilderness. The category was highly competitive, going up against equally impressive visual styles from other films, but the cinematographer had momentum from previous wins, and given the ambition and complexity of the camera work here, another win was well within reach. Despite the overwhelming praise, one nomination feels slightly off: Best Visual Effects. The infamous bear attack is expertly staged and convincingly animated, but it's still obvious the creature is digitally created. The sequence works, but the artificial nature of the bear briefly breaks the illusion against an otherwise grounded, naturalistic portrayal of the wilderness. A minor flaw, but a noticeable one that pulls you out of the moment. That category often feels like a consolation prize for films that don't quite fit the traditional Best Picture mold, and Star Wars may well take it regardless. The bigger question hanging over all of this, Is this DiCaprio's finest performance? Almost certainly yes. It may also be Tom Hardy's most memorable role to date. Add in some striking cinematography, and you've got a serious contender for Film of the Year, though whether it truly earns that title is still open for debate. A lot has already been said about The Revenant, maybe too much, maybe not enough. What's undeniable is that DiCaprio finally earned his Oscar here, and plenty would argue the film itself deserved the top prize too. Set in the harsh American wilderness of the early 1820s, the story follows fur trapper Hugh Glass, brutally attacked by a bear and left for dead near the frozen Missouri River. Against all odds, he survives and embarks on a relentless journey driven by survival and vengeance, particularly against John Fitzgerald, the trapper responsible for killing Glass's son. Visually, the film is often breathtaking, though there are moments when the wilderness feels less isolated than intended. Still, it remains a striking watch overall. Character motivations are clear, with little confusion about where the villainy lies, though some of the dialogue feels oddly modern for the period, which can pull you out of the story. The infamous bear attack is nearly unbearable in its brutality, and the climactic showdown is equally savage and unforgettable. The kind of film that lingers, one many viewers will return to, whether because of or in spite of its intensity. The supporting cast is equally committed, adding to the film's overall authenticity and weight. The story itself is loosely inspired by real events. After Glass is mauled and abandoned, hostile forces close in, and his journey becomes as much about raw endurance as it is about revenge. Written and directed by Ritu, the film marks a shift from his usual character-driven dramas into more physically demanding territory. His familiar stylistic touches, symbolism, dream imagery, fragmented memory are still present, though not always necessary. At times the dramatic elements feel stretched, while the action sequences seem designed to keep modern audiences engaged. Some of it works brilliantly, reinforcing the danger and desperation. Other moments feel a bit forced. Despite the unevenness, the story stays compelling. DiCaprio commits fully, delivering a performance built more on physical suffering than dialogue, and Hardy is effective as the antagonist, though his heavily altered voice can be frustrating at times. The landscape photography is extraordinary, but the film loses some momentum in its final stretch as the pacing slows and extra threads add little to the outcome. The conclusion, while powerful, feels fairly expected. A persistent chill runs through every frame. This is a survival tale drenched in snow, water, and near impossible conditions, with the environment itself acting as a merciless enemy. The production mirrored the on-screen hardship, with well-publicized risks and challenges during filming. Ritu's insistence on practical locations and natural light, avoiding green screens entirely, resulted in a brutally authentic final product, and the cinematography is a major reason for the acclaim. Vast white landscapes punctuated by sudden, shocking violence. It's not an easy watch, and it's not meant to be. DiCaprio's performance, built on endurance, pain, and sheer will, is more impressive than it is flashy. A role that demands respect even if it doesn't always invite outright admiration. Across the long runtime, the lead character doesn't shift gears much from one sequence to the next, and Tom Hardy's antagonist is similarly consistent, menacing, coarse, and unapologetically brutal, without much variation beyond his familiar muttered, heavily accented dialogue. As a whole, the film works reasonably well, though it occasionally stumbles over a hazy backstory that surfaces now and then in an attempt to inject emotional weight, leaning heavily into dreamlike imagery and spiritual symbolism that sometimes feels a bit much. It's far from a masterpiece, but it's a solid entry tailored to an audience that clearly isn't looking for something gentle. From a technical standpoint, the film is frequently stunning. The cinematography, a testament to Emmanuel Lubezki's mastery, is a clear reason his work keeps getting recognized. I tilde plus minus a tilde inverted exclamation mark Ritu makes full use of the punishingly remote locations, capturing them in all their raw, unforgiving beauty, and given the harsh environments involved, the effort from cast and crew alone deserves admiration. The production design rounds things out beautifully, with period-accurate costumes, makeup, and sets that feel deeply textured and lived in. The action sequences lean heavily on practical effects and visceral stunt work, especially during the bloody climax, while digital effects are used sparingly and effectively. The score deepens the atmosphere further. Ryuichi Sakamoto and Alvin Otto's haunting ambient tones gnaw at the edges of the film, reinforcing its bleakness and isolation. That core ordeal remains compelling throughout. After being brutally mauled by a bear and abandoned by his fellow trappers, Hugh Glass has to rely entirely on his survival instincts to cross a merciless wilderness. Even as a bare-bones premise, it's inherently gripping, which explains why the story has endured. Originally told in Michael Punk's novel, I tilde plus minus a tilde inverted exclamation mark Ritu and go-writer Mark L. Smith shape the journey into a narrative full of striking, sometimes genuinely unforgettable moments. The direction is restrained but purposeful, letting certain sequences resonate with quiet power, and the strong ensemble DiCaprio, Hardy, Gleason, and Poulter brings real emotional weight to characters that could easily have felt one note. These are hardened people, but the actors bring both ferocity and vulnerability to the material. It's easy to see why The Revenant earned so much acclaim despite its relentless bleakness. Its depictions of racism, extreme violence, and human cruelty are unflinching, and the film succeeds entirely on its own terms. It's as much about vengeance as survival, and it never softens its portrayal of suffering, whether inflicted on people, animals, or the land itself. That said, the brutality might overwhelm some viewers, occasionally threatening to eclipse the story's emotional core. Even setting that aside, a bit of unease lingers. Though Glass is framed sympathetically, he's still part of a group actively exploiting indigenous land, which complicates how easily the audience can root for him. Some supporting characters get modest depth through brief glimpses of their pasts, but ultimately this is a story centered on settlers, with Fitzgerald standing out as simply the worst among an already morally compromised group. The film's power is undeniable, but its perspective invites scrutiny alongside the admiration. Part of me wishes the story had been told through the eyes of the Pawnee or the Arikara instead, and I'll admit, without shame, that I found myself rooting for the bear. While watching, I kept thinking of a satirical short by the comedy group 5 Second Films called The Revenanting, which pokes fun at the film and DiCaprio's visibly agonized performance, calling it textbook Oscar bait. It's meant as a joke, but the parody lands closer to the truth than you'd expect. That said, I know how cynical I can be, and maybe I'm being a little harsh here. Nitpicking aside, it's hard to deny that The Revenant is, more often than not, an exceptional film. I wouldn't call it essential viewing, but whatever your reason for watching, it's genuinely impressive, provided the brutal, unsettling material doesn't put you off. I'd put off watching it for way too long, and I'm glad I finally did. It absolutely earns its acclaim, and I'm comfortable recommending it. One of my long-standing frustrations with modern Hollywood is how visually repetitive films have gotten bold primary colors everywhere, action scenes chopped into hyperactive edits, continuity techniques that make sequences feel more like extended music videos than coherent storytelling. Throw in the sense that Tom Hardy shows up in nearly every major production these days, and it starts to feel like you've already seen every movie released this century. On top of that, The Revenant comes from I tilde plus minus a tilde inverted exclamation mark Ritu, the filmmaker behind the widely praised but, in my view, somewhat overindulgent Birdman. Everything about this project screamed awards season bait, so I went in with pretty modest expectations. What followed was a genuine surprise. Mild spoilers ahead, and I should apologize for even considering calling this experience pleasant, because it's anything but. And that's not a knock against it. If you're only planning to watch The Revenant because DiCaprio's in it, consider yourself warned. This isn't a glamorous performance piece. Think The Naked Prey reimagined for the modern era, where Cornel Wilde's 1966 film was limited by the constraints of its era. Today's studio system pulls very few punches. If you're sensitive about animals or uneasy with the realities of survival and hunting, it might be worth steering clear. This film doesn't hold back. Ironically, it wasn't the animals that haunted me afterward, it was the humans. Critter pulls off something genuinely remarkable here. I've struggled with his earlier work, but this one stands apart as something truly memorable. The opening attack by Native American warriors is deeply unsettling, largely because it skips the usual Hollywood tricks and no frantic close-ups, no rapid-fire editing, just raw, immersive chaos. The infamous bear attack is even more astonishing, appearing to unfold in a single take with a recognizable star, not a stunt double, being mauled by what feels like a genuinely real animal. I found myself stunned, wondering how the sequence was even possible. What's most striking is that I never once felt like I was watching actors performing roles. Despite the star-studded cast, everyone feels authentic, like people desperately trying to survive the twin merciless forces of nature and human cruelty. Emmanuel Lubezki's cinematography deserves enormous praise. His cold, desaturated visuals capture the unforgiving wilderness perfectly. Stephen Merriam's editing is just as impressive, particularly in several fluid, seamless underwater sequences where it's easy to forget how much effort went into pulling them off. That said, the film isn't flawless. Critter occasionally leans too hard into his arthouse instincts, and some of the stylistic flourishes feel a bit excessive. Given the premise of one man against a hostile environment, the narrative loses some momentum in the final stretch. There's also a small but persistent quirk that kept pulling me out of the story. Glass seems to have an almost supernatural knack for starting fires under any conditions. I suppose we're meant to assume he's carrying flint, but in a landscape this freezing and soaked, finding usable kindling feels like a stretch. Still, those are minor nitpicks. What stands out more to me is how much negative reaction this film has gotten. It makes me wonder whether some viewers were disappointed simply because the film didn't match their expectations, rather than judging it on its own terms. For my part, I found The Revenant unrelentingly harsh and deeply gripping, the most powerful film I'd seen that year, and one I expect to dominate awards season, deservedly so. The word revenant is commonly defined as someone who returns after death or a long absence, and that meaning perfectly captures the ordeal faced by Hugh Glass in Ritter's brutal frontier epic, set in the unforgiving American wilderness of the early 1820s. The film follows Glass as he endures near unimaginable suffering after being savagely mauled by a protective grizzly, only to discover that members of his own expedition have abandoned him, assuming his death was inevitable. His astonishing fight for survival unfolds during a doomed fur trapping mission in territory that would later become part of South Dakota. The word grizzly applies not just to the bear that attacks him but to the relentless string of trials he endures clawing his way back towards civilization and justice. The story draws inspiration from Michael Punk's novel, but the real Hugh Glass was a genuine historical figure whose life ranged across piracy, smuggling, trapping, trading, hunting, and exploring the American frontier. Ritter zeroes in on this defining chapter of Glass's life and surrounds DiCaprio with a physically imposing supporting cast. This is a version of DiCaprio stripped of his usual slickness and charisma, reduced instead to raw instinct and suffering. One of the film's biggest strengths is Tom Hardy's performance as John Fitzgerald, a character so cruel and self-serving that he becomes genuinely infuriating. Hardy commits fully to making him detestable, and he pulls it off with chilling precision. The natural world plays a huge role throughout, with sweeping, awe-inspiring landscapes that dwarf both hero and villain, driving home just how small human lives are against such a hostile backdrop. The production famously took nearly 9 months, with scenes shot in sequence across multiple locations, including remote parts of North and South America. Cinematographer Emmanuel Lubezki worked closely with I+A_Ritu, relying entirely on natural light to give the film raw, immersive realism that few movies attempt. The story kicks off with Glass guiding a fur trading expedition led by Captain Andrew Henry of the Rocky Mountain Fur Company. Early on, the group is ambushed by Arikara warriors, taking heavy losses. Glass pushes for an overland retreat back to their fort, a plan that meets resistance but ultimately wins out. While scouting for food, he stumbles across 2 bear cubs, moments before their enraged mother charges. The attack that follows is savage and chaotic, leaving Glass torn apart but not quite dead. He manages one shot before the mauling, eventually killing the bear in a final desperate act. Gravely injured and unable to move on his own, Glass is carried by his fellow trappers until the terrain becomes impassable. Convinced he won't survive, Captain Henry offers payment to anyone willing to stay behind and see him properly buried. Fitzgerald and young trapper Jim Bridger agree to stay, while Glass's son Hawk refuses to leave his father's side. What follows is a brutal test of endurance, loyalty, and the will to live. Fitzgerald eventually loses patience waiting for Glass to die, and in a ruthless turn, murders Hawk and attempts to bury Glass alive, with a terrified Bridger going along with the betrayal out of fear for his own safety. Against all odds, Glass survives and begins an extraordinary journey through brutal wilderness, driven by the need to reach civilization and confront Fitzgerald for his treachery. Worth noting, The Revenant is actually the 3rd film built around Hugh Glass's incredible survival story. The earliest, 1971's Man in the Wilderness, directed by Richard Sarafian and starring Richard Harris, renamed the character Zachary Bass but clearly modeled him on Glass, a frontiersman who survives a vicious bear attack only to be abandoned by his companions. It's a solid, well-made adventure film for its era, but it doesn't reach the artistic or emotional heights of I+A_Ritu's version. Far less successful was 1975's Apache Blood, an inferior, largely forgettable retelling in which Bill Ewing juggled producing, directing, and cinematography and spread himself too thin. In that version, an army scout named Sam Glass is mauled by a bear, but the execution lacks credibility, and the attack scenes feel awkward compared to Man in the Wilderness, which used a real bear and trainer for authenticity. Despite relying on CGI, The Revenant still delivers a far more visceral, believable version of the attack. All 3 films, along with Punk's novel, share the same foundational story. A resilient protagonist survives a devastating bear attack, is presumed dead, and is betrayed by the people meant to protect him, though the nature of that betrayal shifts in each version. In Man in the Wilderness, it's Percy Herbert's character who abandons Harris in Apache Blood. It's a group of cowardly soldiers in The Revenant. It's Hardy's Fitzgerald showing utter disloyalty toward DiCaprio's Glass. Inevitably, the pacing slows once the wounded hero starts wandering alone through the wilderness, but that isolation is essential to the story's emotional weight. Despite its stretches of quiet desolation, The Revenant is a visually arresting, technically remarkable film, fully deserving of its 12 Oscar nominations. It's a shame the film sometimes gets casually written off as just a remake, as though the earlier versions never existed. John Huston's Man in the Wilderness, more accurately Richard Sarafian's film was the first major attempt to bring this true story to screen and deserves recognition for that. That said, comparing the two directly is tricky, Given the decades separating them and the massive differences in budget, technology, and available filmmaking tools, The Revenant was a sprawling, years-long production, meticulously built scene by scene, while Man in the Wilderness came together in a much shorter window under harsher, more real-world conditions. Building on that earlier film's preference for location shooting and practical technique, it leaned into a stronger revenge-driven arc, which, while a departure from historical accuracy, adds real dramatic weight. The result is a lavish, meticulously constructed film that showcases its obsessive attention to detail and firmly establishes DiCaprio as the emotional center of the whole experience. The craftsmanship here is undeniable, a true cinematic achievement. That said, a revenge-driven story can feel thin if the audience doesn't emotionally connect with either the person seeking vengeance or the target of it. Revenge might be a believable, even primal motivation given the setting and era, but without deeper emotional engagement, it risks becoming repetitive. In the end, The Revenant is an endurance test for both its protagonist and its audience, building toward a final confrontation that delivers exactly what it promises. The story centers on revenge following unimaginable brutality, a man left for dead after a savage bear attack, then betrayed by the very person who later kills his son. But does to actually use this premise to say anything meaningful about human nature? Beyond a few brief flashbacks establishing that Hugh Glass once had a wife who was killed, the film offers little emotional grounding, and there's minimal reason to connect with DiCaprio's character beyond his sheer endurance. Tom Hardy's antagonist reads less like a layered human being and more like an exaggerated embodiment of cruelty, lacking subtlety or depth. Ito's direction often feels overly deliberate, as if every frame is carefully posed to announce its own importance. And the result unfortunately is a visually impressive but monotonous film that runs longer than it needs to. DiCaprio is almost universally expected to win an Oscar for this role, though the performance feels strikingly familiar, another variation on the suffering-heavy roles he's leaned into repeatedly in recent years. Much of the praise seems to focus on how physically demanding the shoot was rather than any real emotional nuance in the acting, and honestly, the extraordinary makeup and physical transformation do a lot of the heavy lifting for him. Birdman remains the only a film that's genuinely resonated with me, and this project only reinforces the sense that it might have been an exception. His worldview seems to be that life is something to be endured until redemption arrives. Somewhere beyond it, a philosophy that just doesn't connect with me, which leaves his films feeling emotionally distant. Keep breathing. Those words are whispered early in the film by Hugh Glass to his young son Hawk, a small piece of advice that echoes through the rest of the story, and maybe a quiet nod to audiences trying to get through the relentless brutality on screen. From a technical standpoint, this is undeniably a showcase of elite craftsmanship. Reunited with cinematographer Emmanuel Lubezki, it creates imagery that's both stunning and punishing in its realism. DiCaprio and Hardy shed any trace of movie star polish to deliver raw, physically grounded performances in this adaptation of Michael Punk's novel, itself inspired by true events. The opening Arikara attack is sudden and ferocious, dropping viewers straight into a hostile early 19th century frontier where survival is never a given. Just as the tension starts to ease, the film delivers its most infamous moment, an astonishingly brutal bear attack, filmed to look like a single unbroken take. It's visceral, relentless, and unforgettable, turning DiCaprio's Glass into a battered symbol of human resilience. Hardy brings a chilling intensity to Fitzgerald, a man driven by greed and self-preservation. His intimidation of Bridger and his clashes with Captain Henry crackle with menace, and even though his heavily accented dialogue can be hard to catch, His physical presence perfectly fits the unforgiving frontier setting. There are few moments of relief across this nearly 3-hour ordeal, though film history buffs might crack a small smile at the appearance of the name Jim Bridger. Still, smiles are rare in a movie designed to test both its characters and its audience. An Oscar win for DiCaprio wouldn't be surprising, whether it's for the performance itself or for simply surviving the shoot is another question entirely. This is a performance stripped of vanity, with nothing to do with charm or conventional appeal. Raw, exhausting, and deeply committed. At its core, the film is a survival story and a revenge saga, but it's also a stark meditation on nature itself, majestic in its beauty, merciless in its cruelty. Visually, it often reaches a near-poetic quality, evoking the contemplative style of filmmakers like Terence Malick, before those serene moments get abruptly shattered by overwhelming violence, roaring rapids dragging glass over a waterfall, or the unforgettable image of a man and horse plunging off a cliff. The journey stays intentionally vague on time and distance, but the physical punishment along the way is unmistakable. This isn't an easy watch. It demands endurance from the audience just as much as from its protagonist. If you can resist looking away, the visuals will reward you even as they make you wince. Technically, the achievement is astonishing. Shot on location in Canada and Argentina using almost entirely natural light, the film captures textures of nature that most movies ignore entirely. Every sound, arrows cutting through air, animal growls, labored breathing, feels amplified and essential. The animal hide costumes add to the authenticity, and the blend of practical and digital effects is seamless enough that it's nearly impossible to tell where reality ends and illusion begins. The result is a visceral experience that lingers well after the credits roll. This is a chilling, relentless tale of survival and vengeance, elevated by extraordinary atmosphere. The story itself is relatively simple, but the execution is anything but a proof that even a familiar narrative can become extraordinary in the right hands. Compared to other atmospheric war and survival classics, this one stands apart not through originality of plot but through how deeply it immerses you in its world. It follows a frontiersman betrayed by his own companions and left to die in a frozen wilderness after a brutal bear attack and the murder of his son. And what follows is a punishing journey fueled by grief and an unyielding need for justice. On paper, the plot sounds straightforward, but the screenplay and visual storytelling elevate it into something genuinely unforgettable, a masterclass in how craft alone can turn a simple premise into a powerful experience. DiCaprio delivers one of the most physically demanding performances of his career, a role that stands as a defining moment and justifies every bit of the praise it's received. Hardy is equally compelling, playing his character with a disturbing realism that makes him both repulsive and fascinating. The score deepens the tension throughout, reinforcing the cold, oppressive mood of each scene, and the director's achievement here is extraordinary. Winning back-to-back Best Director awards feels entirely justified. Where his previous film leaned heavily on technical bravado, this one balances ambition with emotional weight and authenticity, making it a more complete and deserving accomplishment overall. Ultimately, this is a film that demands your full attention. Watch it without distractions, let it consume you. It's harsh, draining, and at times punishing, but also hauntingly beautiful. A modern classic that proves cinema can still be both brutal and breathtaking. The Revenant communicates far more through imagery and physical suffering than through words. Dialogue is sparse, yet the emotional and physical impact hits hard regardless. Two pivotal moments in particular define Hugh Glass's relentless will to survive. The now iconic bear attack isn't just shocking for its brutality, it's shocking for how technically accomplished it is, unfolding with an almost documentary-style realism that feels like a single uninterrupted take. The blend of visual effects and raw staging makes it one of the most punishing sequences in modern cinema, rivaling even the most extreme moments of that year. The second defining moment comes later, when Glass lies helpless and barely conscious, fully aware that survival now depends on endurance rather than strength. And it's in this vulnerable moment that Fitzgerald commits his unforgivable act. DiCaprio's performance here is extraordinary, not because of dialogue but because of restraint. Without saying a word, he conveys rage, sorrow, guilt, grief, and despair with haunting precision. If any single scene earns him the accolades, it's this one. Rarely has such a range of emotion been expressed so powerfully in total silence.